Andrew Omtatah, Busia County.
Madam Speaker, thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this very important debate. I will begin by referring to the Constitution, which is my Bible or my Quran on matters governance. Article 220 of the Constitution provides for how our budgets have to be made, their content, timing, and form. And within that particular section, it's clearly stated that our debts must be contained in the budgets, in the annual budgets that are made. The proposals to borrow and where money is to be borrowed from should be in the budget that comes to the parliament every year. Now, contrary to that, Parliament has done something very strange and totally unconstitutional in this country by enacting something called the debt ceiling in the Public Finance Management Act. The debt ceiling, the concept of a debt ceiling has got a history. Before 1917, in the USA, Congress used to approve every debt that was borrowed by the Treasury for the executive in America, in the USA. In 2017, when the USA joined the First World War, Congress began the idea of allowing the Treasury to borrow on a need. And that morphed into the culture where they began the so-called debt ceiling in an attempt to contain the appetite for money by the executive. And up to now, you even have the Debt Act that was passed under Obama trying to address these issues. They have not done very well. So we have gone ahead and borrowed the idea of a debt ceiling from the Americans who did it out of an emergency situation and failed to go back to the default that they used to have, where Congress approved every debt. And now we are trying to peg our debt on GDP. First of all, it doesn't make any sense, any common sense, to peg a debt on GDP when you know that GDP is the collective, the totality of the productivity of a state as estimated per year. And yet you repay debt, not from your percentage of GDP, you repay debt from your taxes. Debt must be tied to the capacity to raise taxes to pay them. And that's why in Article 220, there is a requirement that Parliament, in every budget that the executive proposes, in Article 221C, it says, 1B, first of all, it says, budgets of the national and county governments shall contain proposals for financing any anticipated deficit for the period to which they apply. C, proposals regarding borrowing and other forms of public liability that will increase public debt during the following year. Now, when you look at our budget, Parliament always passes a balanced budget that conforms to those two provisions. That budget is contained in the appropriation bill. And each appropriation bill is what gives us the legitimate debt within the Republic of Kenya. Now, I've taken my time to examine our appropriation bills from 2017 to 2025 and established that Parliament only approved 2 trillion, has only approved 2 trillion 791 billion 543 million 336,707 shillings. Yet, when you examine the debt register published by the Treasury, you find that we have borrowed 8 trillion 918 billion 21 million 659,782 shillings, which means we have borrowed 6 trillion 950,163 billion 6 trillion 950 billion 163 million 132,328 shillings outside the law. Other than that, we have also seen the other activity that happened the other day. We were told that the Eurobond had matured and the government required to borrow extra money from the Eurobond market to offset what had become due. And they borrowed quite a bit of money. Yet, the Constitution in Article 214 states categorically that the public debt is a direct charge on the consolidated fund. The Public Finance Management Act 2 and the regulations forbid borrowing money to pay another debt, borrowing money to pay a debt. So why does the government get powers to do these kind of things? And I'm in particular referring to section 15, 2C, and 50 clause 3 of the Public Finance Management Act. When we borrow money against the law, what are we trying to achieve? What evidence is there that the debt for the Eurobond had not been paid off as required by law automatically as a direct charge to the consolidated fund, that we had to go borrowing further money for it? Madam Speaker, as I proceed to submit, I also want to observe that of the odious debt that I've referred to, 4 trillion 605 billion 840 million 287,992 shillings was incurred in the period 2014 to 2022, when President Uhuru Kenyatta was in charge. Under President Ruto, that's from 2022 when he took over, already 2 trillion 250 billion 325 million 905,200 shillings has been taken outside the law. We have a program-based budgeting process whereby when money is borrowed, it's tied to a project. These trillions of shillings, more than 6 trillion, cannot be traced in government documents. I've taken my time from October last year, poring over thousands of documents that I got from the websites of the Treasury, Central Bank, Control of Budget, and all these people. And I cannot trace where this money went. I can see why the 2-point-something trillion that the parliament approved is clearly seen where it went. This money cannot be traced in the economy. To make matters worse, Madam Speaker, not a single domestic debt is approved by parliament. Not a single one. All those billions. Look at the Appropriation Act. There's none. It's somehow that the executive does not implement the budget. Because when you look at the statement of annual revenue and actual revenue and net expenditure, which is published monthly, at the end of every month, the statement of actual revenue and net expenditure. That's why you encounter this animal called the domestic debt. If you look at the budget, there's no domestic debt. Treasury bonds, treasury bills are a legitimate form of, treasury bills are supposed to act like an overdraft. Where there's a delay by the treasury, by the KRA to submit enough money to government, the government should issue treasury bills to fill up the gap, but the treasury bills by law must be paid within 12 months. They cannot become a debt. Now, under the Public Finance Management Act, all borrowing must support a capital project, a development project which is defined. But you find that we are borrowing a lot of money on the domestic market without approval of Parliament. Where does this money go when it is not even budgeted for? Why are we borrowing this money? And it's running in billions of shillings. Madam Speaker, I wish our screens were working. I would have beamed my calculations onto that screen so that Kenyans can see how they are being scammed in the name of taking public debt. I've done a graph, and you realize one of the interesting things is that our debt spikes every time we have got a handshake. Well, which means that the mechanisms of oversight are lost. In every year when you have had a handshake, there's been a spike in reckless borrowing and reckless expenditure by government. I hope it doesn't happen today. It's just unfortunate that we cannot, I don't know whether we are allowed or not, but I would have loved to be projecting some of these figures on these screens that we have here, so that all Kenyans can see exactly how we are being messed up, how we are being hurt. And another painful thing is that the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, which is all over demanding more powers and all that out of you, has never audited our debt portfolio. I don't understand why they cannot just let the police, the economic crimes unit of the CID, do their work. The ESCC has never audited our debt. You find again, one of the things that has made our debt shoot up from 2014 is that Parliament amended the Public Finance Management Act to allow for money borrowed to be kept offshore, contrary to Article 206, which requires that all money borrowed must be kept in the consolidated fund. So they amended that, and at the discretion of the Cabinet Secretary for Treasury, they can borrow money and keep offshore. And that's one of the things that is really affecting us. When you look at the total amount of debt that we have borrowed, many people discuss it in terms of the actual figures borrowed. But if you factor in, Madam Speaker, you factor in the cost of the loans, and you factor in the interest on the loans, you get a shocking figure. Right now, we are standing at 18 trillion shillings when you take those factors in. Totally unsustainable for us. And I think in the last payment I've seen in this statement, and the projections of paying 1.7 trillion, 2.7 trillion in debt and what have you, those kind of projections are not good for this country. They're existential threats to this country. You cannot have a budget of, say, 3.7 trillion and spend 1.7 trillion repaying debt, and only 700 billion of the 1.7 trillion goes to paying off the principal, and 1 trillion goes to paying interest. That cannot work. It's going to sink this country. Another issue, Madam Speaker, that I would like to speak to is another form of debt that is not necessarily public debt, but it's a debt to the public in the name of pending bills. Pending bills, Madam Speaker, are a major scam. And the scam masters have convinced everybody in this country that we abandon cash-based accounting, we go to accrual accounting. Arrant nonsense. How do you do that? When you implement a budget, and a budget is an act of parliament, a budget is a law, or a budget is an act of a county assembly, it's a law. How do you accrue from one law to another law without referring back to parliament? How do you carry a debt from year 1 to year 2, when year 1, parliament said, or the National County Assembly said, we are giving you this budget, we are giving you this power to collect funds, you should deal with that case. And you have been given the capacity to do an appropriation bill, an appropriation, a supplementary budget, where emergencies occur that you may not have foreseen. So this drive that we are going to go to accrual accounting, when governments are run on a cash basis, special hours, and it's anchored in the Constitution, is another monster that's going to eat up this country. And we need to look it in the face and say, how do you achieve that? Because the people from is it ISPAC or whatever, these accountants, have come and they're hollering all over that that's what happens in the private sector. Who tells them that you can run a government like a private sector account? We implement budgets, which are laws. So I don't see a mechanism of accruing an issue from one budget to another budget without going back to parliament. I know that dispensations, there are countries which run on accrual basis, but it's not in their law. It's not in their constitution. A unique feature of Kenya's constitution that we have got chapter 12 on public finance, which tries to cure mischief that has happened in this country since independence, whereby public coffers have never been respected. That's why we have that purely technical chapter in our constitution prescribing what should be done. So when we move away from that and say, so and so does it, so and so does it, so and so the majority are doing it, but what is in their constitution? Is it like ours? Why did we put in our constitution? What are we trying to cure? So, Madam Speaker, I pray that this House, and I'm aware that this House even made some very grievous decision. It passed a motion saying that pending bills will be a first charge on the county revenue fund. And the logic, they said, okay, Article 14 of the 214 of the Constitution, Article 214 of the Constitution justifies or states that a public debt is a first charge on the consolidated fund. But they read 214 part 1. They did not read part 2, which then defines what is a public debt. Part 2 of 214 defines a public debt to be loans, guarantees for loans, and expenses incurred and related matters to loans. A pending bill where a county government has taken MCAs on a baseline study and they incur money and they can't pay, how does that become a public debt? Or you have contracted somebody to build a road and you don't pay him, you could divert money to pay somebody else. How does that become a public debt? How does that become a first charge on the county revenue fund? Madam Speaker, we need to get serious, and I'm requesting that this parliament sets up induction courses for members of parliament on the Constitution of Kenya, and especially on Chapter 12, so that we can fully comprehend as a House what the architecture for handling public finances is, and then going forward, we'll be able to engage effectively and according to the book. With those few remarks, Madam Speaker, I thank you for the opportunity, and I don't support the recommendations made because they're unconstitutional. But I know I might be the only voice, but it doesn't matter when I'm the only voice. I don't support them. They are totally unconstitutional, and they should go back and have a reference to the Constitution. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Koito Omtatah. Senator Matthew John Muhia, Nyandarua County.
Thank